tonight we deal with an equally interesting topic, the energy revolution and how it changes geopolitics. Our guest tonight is widely recognized as one of the very leading authorities on energy economics in the United States. He's presently head of global research on commodities at Citigroup. He's held that same kind of position in a number of firms previously. He also is an editor of one of the major journals publishing on energy. And he also, interestingly, is the president of an organization, nonprofit, which encourages information to be shared in an educational sense around the nation. And along that same line of education, he is an advisor to the program at Columbia on international and public affairs. He similarly is on the advisory board at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Now, all of those things point to his credentials for this evening's presentation, but he may not want me to say this, but he has 50 years of background behind all of that, which is most impressive. But one of the more interesting things, he's a Johns Hopkins undergrad and a MA from Johns Hopkins SAIS before he got his PhD from Princeton. He taught at Princeton at the Woodrow Wilson School for half a dozen years, teaching international politics essentially. And I underline that because of the concept of global impact, geopolitics, flowing from the energy circumstance. And he is used to dealing with larger ideas. I noticed that one of his books, which I haven't read, has to do with modernization and the transformation of the international political order. Now that, of course, is a matter of thinking rather broadly about larger impacts of the immediate events. He, as I say, taught there for a while. He was at the Council on Foreign Relations for 3 years, and then joined the State Department, where he was an Assistant Secretary of State for International Energy Policy. Following that, he went into the business community, but he also went into, after a few years with Phillips, a very interesting decade and a half where he was a founder of a firm which did energy research and consulting, and at the same time was president of a journal which was publishing intelligence research. And then after that period, he rejoined the corporate world, as I said, and he's been at Credit Suisse. He was at Lehman Brothers, and now he's at Citigroup. My point is that he's had an academic background. He's thought about large questions. He's reflected on international politics, and he's immersed himself in international research on energy. His credentials are impeccable. He's been ranked for what these rankings are worth among the 100 most interesting commentators on global affairs, and he's been ranked very high on experts on Wall Street as well. But I'm going to assert tonight that those rankings are true, and he deserves every bit of it, and they're very flattering. It's a great pleasure to present to you Dr. Edward L. Morse.
Thanks very much for that really wonderful introduction. When Frank Bird approached me asking whether I would come to interact with you some evening, I immediately said yes, wondering when I was going to have time to do that. And of course I said yes because I kind of don't treat lightly any invitation to return to Baltimore, where I really and truly had my most formative years as I grew up. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to talk to you about energy. Energy is kind of critical to all of us. For millennia, we have managed to find ways through human ingenuity to get cheaper and cheaper energy. We don't always see that in our lifetimes, because there are times, like much of the last half century, when we saw energy costs going up significantly. But basically, the story of mankind is a story of finding cheaper and cheaper sources of energy to allow us to do things that we otherwise might not do, to get more out of a lower and lower amount of effort. The shale revolution that's unfolding in the U.S. over the last decade plus is truly a revolution along the lines of history of finding cheaper ways to find ways to get through and use energy to do a multiple number of things with. It's probably as significant an invention as anything that has come out of Silicon Valley, both in terms of where it is in terms of leading technology and in terms of what the leverage is gained by harnessing this not new source of energy, but a source of energy that can, for the first time, be tapped into. It really is a very high-tech business. And I'd like to spend the first few minutes shortly, really, to describe to you why this is so critically important and what it is all about, whether you love or don't love hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons that we use, whether they're coal-related or natural gas or oil, in the case of natural gas and oil, come out of the original source rock, which is truly shale source rock. Molecules of hydrocarbons migrate out of this source rock, sometime because Mother Nature provides mechanisms of fracturing rock through earthquakes, sometimes by finding porosity here and there. What we have come to think of as conventional oil and gas, which has been exploited globally, first in this country and in Russia about a century and a half ago, a little more than that. That conventional hydrocarbon material is comprised of molecules that have migrated out of this original dense source rock through semi-porous rock and then has gotten trapped by rocks in reservoirs that were very easy to tap into. You essentially found a way to put a straw in the ground at the right place, and you could, if you accidentally found a way to find hydrocarbons, put in another straw to get the hydrocarbons that you found out of the ground. That's what conventional oil and gas is really about. It's finding, through increasingly scientific methods, this trapped material, which gives rise to oil or gas under pressure that can come easily out of the ground. The shale revolution began in a period of relatively high prices, so people were trying to find ways to experiment. And it's very much a made-in-America story. It's a made-in-America story in that it is comprised of a combination of three kinds of very greedy sets of people in a combination with one another that is pretty unique in the U.S. So the first kind of greedy people involved in this are independent geologists or engineers. And we have 10,000 companies in the U.S., more or less, of entrepreneurs who are trying to find ways to get rich by pushing the envelope with truth as they go to sources of finance and pushing the envelope of technology. And they were pushing the envelope in the period of the last decade, particularly after 2003, when oil and gas prices and all other commodity prices were going up and we were allegedly living in an age of scarcity. The second component of greediness in the U.S. Domestic scene are greedy people with money. We have a financial services sector that provides capital to these greedy entrepreneurs who otherwise don't have a lot of cash. So unlike very large companies, and you can name them because you see signs on gasoline stations with their names on them, unlike those companies which use the cash they generate out of their operations to undertake risky business, these 10,000 companies don't have the cash. So they go to the financial services sector to find people who are willing to provide the capital and they extract an unusually large part of the rents as a result of provision of capital. The third feature of the American landscape, which is absolutely unique to the United States, is that we live in the only country in the world in which individual citizens are allowed constitutionally to own minerals under the ground. In all other countries in the world, with no exception, the government owns the mineral resources. But in our country, private citizens own the mineral resources. Sometimes those private citizens are Indian lands owned by Indian tribes. Sometimes they are acquired by groups and institutions who buy mineral rights from the original landowners. But they too are greedy, and they have the right to lease out their acreage and their mineral rights to the greedy entrepreneurs and the greedy guys or women coming from the financial services sector. And that makes for an easier way to exploit resources than would be the case if the government owned them, and if you have land where the government owns the mineral rights under your land. You don't want dirty kinds of activity taking place in your neighborhood. But if you are a landholder, say, in the state of Pennsylvania, and you have 1,000 acres of land for farming, and farming is not really a great business to be in, and you can lease out your property, your 1,000 acres for $30,000 an acre, and then get a royalty cut of 1/7 of all of the value of the molecules that are extracted, you have a stake in this business. So that's the three features that allowed this revolution to take place in the U.S. High prices were the environment in the last decade, and people got on the road to find ways to get natural gas out of the ground when the price of natural gas had gone up in our country, which was seeing a decline in natural gas production and an increase in natural gas use, and the price of natural gas was $10 or $11 or $12 per million BTU. That's what got this revolution going in the last decade. On the natural gas side, it was truly amazing because the ability to do what was done is the equivalent, and here we are in Baltimore, and I know the geography a little bit. The high-tech part of this is you have imaging taken from satellites that can, at this stage, actually pinpoint a place 4 miles from here. Let's say it's under the Homewood campus at Hopkins, and it's right under Homewood House. And the target that you have is a target about the size of this little dais that I'm speaking behind. And your right to get there requires you to drill underneath where this building is. So let's make believe the building isn't here, but it's land. And you can drill down 3 or 4 miles and then drill out to under Homewood House and hit this target, which we now know over experience is a sweet spot to produce hydrocarbons. It's a very high-tech business as it's evolved. And the result of that was that the U.S. seeing a declining production base in natural gas, all of a sudden saw phenomenal growth, spurred on by high prices. And one thought at the beginning this was going to be a very high-cost venture. The result has been really remarkable. Since the revolution began when, and I'll throw numbers out that don't mean anything to you, but I'll try to put them in context. The U.S. was producing 55 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas only 5 years ago. And now the U.S. is producing 72 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas, having overtaken Russia as the largest natural gas producing country in the world. Gas was discovered in the state of Pennsylvania in a remarkable quantity and at a very low cost. So if it took a trigger price of $12 per million BTU to get the exploitation going in the state of Pennsylvania, you can profitably produce natural gas at $2.50 per million BTU. And the state of Pennsylvania, if it were a country, today would be the third largest natural gas producing country in the world. After the United States, Russia, Pennsylvania would be number 3. And not only would it be number 3, but our expectation is that the state of Pennsylvania, currently producing about 16.5 billion cubic feet a day, will easily be able to double that quantity and sustain that production level for 200 years. So this is the revolution that's at hand. If you want to think for a minute about the uses of natural gas, we expect that between now and 2020, 6 years from now, the production of natural gas will grow in the United States by between 20 and 25 billion cubic feet a day on the 71 billion cubic feet a day base as of the last month. What's taken over for the time being is that we had natural gas replacing oil or used in industry where it was underutilized for a period of time. And now, from now to 2020 and beyond, we're seeing new investment taking place based on the availability of this supply. And that new investment will trigger truly revolutionary consequences, as though the amount of employment already resulting from this exploitation didn't really count. So let me give you some examples. And I know that environmentalists don't like exports because it's taking dirty material and exporting dirty material to the world. But just to give you a sense of what's happening with natural gas, the U.S. was expected to be the largest importer of natural gas in the world a decade ago, 8 years ago, when our gas production was falling. Now our gas production is rising, and one of the main markets for natural gas is exports. Exports by pipeline and exports by liquefaction. By pipeline, exporting to eastern Canada and to Mexico. And that will have an impact on the U.S. current account balance. It will have an impact a little bit on employment. It has a really remarkably important impact on Mexico, where energy costs in Mexico currently are double that of the OECD, the Organization of Advanced Economies. Electricity prices in the U.S. are already half the average of the OECD. They will go down rather than go up as we convert more and more to natural gas. And Mexico, too, will see natural gas flow into a system of high electricity costs, and they, too, will become a low electricity generating country. Mexico is opening up its oil and gas industry. We tend to think of Mexico as an oil and gas producing country. Mexico really is transformed. Only 8% of Mexico's GDP is associated with oil and gas. Mexico is the fourth largest automobile exporting country in the world. It's the sixth largest manufacturing center for the aerospace industry. It's an industrializing economy, and lower electricity prices based on natural gas imports from the U.S. will be very significant. Already in the last 3 years, Mexican imports of natural gas have trebled to almost 3 billion cubic feet a day. We will export about a B or B and a half a day per year to Mexico. There's currently 3 billion cubic feet a day of capacity on Mexico's side to import. By 2018, there will be 9 billion cubic feet a day of capacity, pipelines already being laid into Mexico. And that would make the U.S. On its own the second largest natural gas exporting country in the world. We're also going to export LNG, and the LNG facilities that have already been approved and where work is underway amount to about the same amount as the pipeline gas that will be going to Mexico and Canada. And that will inevitably make the U.S. by the end of this decade a larger LNG exporting country than Qatar. The U.S. will be the largest LNG exporting country in the world and will be the largest natural gas exporting country in the world, almost no matter what, between now and 2020. And that, of course, brings benefits to the economy, but it has really remarkable geopolitical impacts. So the first of the geopolitical impacts that I'd like to walk you through has to do with the world of natural gas, which is not a market-friendly world. It's a world in which the exporters of natural gas have done two things that we generally consider to be anti-competitive in nature. One is they tie the price of natural gas to the price of oil, so there can't be gas-on-gas competition. The U.S., as a result of the gas revolution, has seen the relationship between gas and oil prices in the U.S. change from 7 to 1 to 25 to 1 on a BTU equivalent basis. In the rest of the world, that same 7 to 1 ratio takes hold. The gas exporters not only link it to oil, but they also put in destination restrictions so that if you're a buyer of gas from Russia or from Qatar or from other gas exporting countries, you don't have the right to re-export it, but we have anti-competitive laws in place in the U.S. So anybody who buys a molecule of U.S. gas in global markets will not be restrained by the U.S. government from re-exporting it to some other country. And we will quickly see the pricing power of the gas producers, and I picked Russia and Qatar as the two biggest ones. We'll see that undermined, because the spot market will emerge very quickly after next year when the U.S. becomes an LNG exporter of consequence for the first time. Just to rapidly look at what else you use natural gas for, you use it to replace coal in utilities for cleaner power generation. So beyond exports, there's power generation. Beyond power generation, there's further use of a relatively clean resource in residential and commercial space heating as our economy grows again and as we expand the residential commercial sector. We have very limited ability left to replace fuel oil use in households because most of that substitution has already taken place, although there's still some 600,000 barrels a day of fuel oil used in households that will be replaced. The more important areas are the two that I'm about to talk about. One is in industrial use of natural gas. This year starts the big change in industrial use of natural gas. So we have unfolding build-out of fertilizer plants in the U.S. using the cheapest natural gas in the world, other than the world of natural gas in Qatar, to build out fertilizers which will no longer import from other countries, which will further make our agricultural sector significantly more competitive than it already is as the most competitive agricultural sector in the world. But we're also seeing natural gas used to replace coal in steel manufacturing. We are already the cheapest manufacturing country in the world for tubular steel. There's a kind of nice relationship between tubular manufacture and tubular use in that the extractive industries are very tubular intensive, whether for drilling purposes or for transporting material from one place to another. We will be seeing more of that. We'll be seeing the petrochemical industry of the U.S. expanding by some 40% between 2017 and 2020, because that's how long it takes to get these projects going. It is really the basis of an industrial revolution. The final implication of it is in the transportation fuel sector, where oil has had a monopoly from the beginning of time. And it's not just electric vehicles that will intrude into the monopoly of oil in the transportation fuel mix, but it's also going to be natural gas as compressed natural gas in passenger vehicles and liquefied natural gas in trucks, which will make the transportation sector significantly cheaper than it has been, not to speak of LNG on the rail side. Let me turn to oil for a minute. Also, at the beginning of this revolution, we were seeing our oil production decline. We've seen our oil production grow remarkably quickly at more than 1 million barrels a day per year. In 2014, global oil demand is growing in the world at a rate of around 650,000 barrels a day per year. That's a low rate because the world economy is not in great shape. I suspect by the end of this year we will have discovered that U.S. oil production, if we're just looking at crude oil, will have grown by 1,200,000 barrels a day. Natural gas liquid production, liquids produced alongside of natural gas, will have grown by 500,000 barrels a day. The main reason oil prices have fallen this year is that finally the geopolitical implications of the shale revolution in the U.S. are unfolding. And they unfolded in a relatively dramatic way this year because we have this year really rejected out of North America imports of light crude from any other part of the world. The U.S. and Eastern Canada only in 2010 imported 2,600,000 barrels a day of light, low-sulfur crude oil from West Africa, the Mediterranean, Central Asia, and Northwest Europe. We currently import about 200,000 barrels a day between the U.S. and Canada. And a lot of this ramp-up was this year, as a result of which there is a glut of light crude in the Atlantic Basin, and countries like OPEC members Angola, Nigeria, and Algeria are finding it very difficult to find alternative markets for their crude oil. This is also a year in which we're seeing Canadian crude without Keystone XL pipeline being built, reaching the U.S. Gulf Coast in very large quantities, making it very difficult for Mexican, Venezuelan, Saudi, Iraqi, or Kuwaiti crude to enter the U.S. Gulf Coast market, which is a phenomenal challenge to the exporters in OPEC, which are having a very difficult time trying to preserve market share given the failure of the petrostate that has arisen in the world over the very few 4 years since the first Libyan supply disruption in the winter of 2010-2011. We're seeing effectively a challenge between the United States and OPEC on pricing power. The one, the U.S. based on market pricing, the other based on everything other than market pricing. And let me summarize it as follows. We've had in the 5 decades since OPEC was created, the economics of oil turned on its head. Typically, in a resource, you have the cheapest material coming to the market first and the most expensive material coming to the market last. OPEC is designed to make sure that market doesn't work that way, but rather by restricting exports. They restrict flows of the lowest cost oil in the world, and they maximize the rents that they can achieve between the price that they get in the market and the cost of production. I'll get into pricing in a moment, but the main feature of pricing in the U.S. is that the costs of production keep going down and down and down. And I'll get back to that before I open this up to discussion. We're seeing an inability of OPEC to confront this growing amount of production coming out of the U.S. and the revolution. Shale rocks are everywhere. You can't hold it only in the U.S. This is going to spread around the world, and it's going to make OPEC's pricing power significantly lower than it currently is. And to give you a sense of the dilemma of an OPEC country, Saudi Arabia was, next to Canada, the largest or the second largest exporter of crude oil to the United States. A year ago, September, Saudi Arabia exported 1,600,000 barrels a day to the U.S. To give you a sense of what's happened to the U.S. import market, in 2007, at its peak, the U.S. was a net importer of 13.2 million barrels a day of oil. We are currently a net importer of 5 million barrels a day of oil. The reduction of consumption that we've had through conservation and efficiency, plus the production revolution, has reduced our net dependence by 8.2 million barrels a day. 8.2 million barrels a day is a larger number than the total consumption of the U.S. or the total consumption. So it's a lower number than the total consumption of the U.S. or the total consumption of China, but it's larger than the total consumption of any other country in the world. It's a very large number, and we project that that's going to decline to zero or a negative number, namely we'll be a net positive exporting country regardless of what or who the president is and how the president deals with Keystone XL or export policy, and I'm happy to answer questions on that. What I want to suggest is that when I wake up in the morning today, and think about the oil market, I have exactly the opposite view that I had in 2009. when I woke up in the morning in 2009, I thought that the U.S. was going to be importing more oil each year. I thought the U.S. production was going to decline. I thought the cost of oil was going to go up. I thought the dependence on the outside world was going to go up. When I wake up now and think about this market, I think U.S. production is going to go up, U.S. consumption is going to go down. I think the cost of finding and developing oil and gas is going to go down. And I think that everything about the geopolitics are turning themselves on their head. And the main reason for that really has to do with a challenge of the new world versus the old world of conventional oil, which was really cheaper to harness at the beginning, was a world in which the cheapest well that you put in was the first well that you drilled. And with every additional well, you got incrementally less oil out of that same reservoir, so that each incremental well cost more than the first well until you get to the most expensive well at the end when you're deciding on whether to extend the life of a field or to go into early abandonment. That's the most expensive well. This, on the shale side, is a manufacturing process. So instead of the first well being the cheapest and the second being more expensive, the first well is the most expensive and the second is cheaper, and the second 10 are cheaper than the first, and the next 100 are cheaper than the second 10, and the next 1,000 are cheaper than the 100. And this has to do with the manufacturing process. It also has to do with efficiency gains. And let me just walk you through the efficiency gains before I talk about the risks. The efficiency gains are such that at the beginning of the decade, a typical well in North Dakota cost $12 million to drill. Today, it costs $6 million to drill. At the beginning of the decade, the first well might have created in its initial production 150 barrels a day. Today, it burns 550 barrels a day. At the beginning, you could keep that initial production up for a month. Today, you could sustain that initial production for 3 months. Those are remarkable efficiency gains. The rate of efficiency gains are 26% per annum, and there's no end yet in sight, and the rocks are very extensive. 2 other points, and then we'll have fun interacting with one another. Are there risks to this, or is this sort of a kind of a free good that we've been granted? No, there are risks. There are serious risks, and there are 2 that I'd like to explore very briefly. One is the risks associated with environmental concerns. Those environmental concerns are multiple. They relate to the uses of water and the adequacy of water and the integrity of water supply, because typically, except in Wyoming where it's the reverse, you go through an aquifer before you go through and hit the sedimentary, the basins that you want to, the rocks that you want to exploit. So you go through water, both on the drilling way down and on the way up, using the other straw to suck material out of the earth. Best practices have, by and large, reduced the risks of contamination or the risk to the integrity of reservoirs pretty completely. The problem is not best practices. The problem is that best practices do not extend across the U.S. because we have a country of 50 states that each puts in its own environmental regulations. And you can have states like Texas or Pennsylvania where the environmental regulations are pretty strict. You can have states like New York, where I live, where the environmental regulations are so strict you can't use fracking, hydraulic fracturing techniques, or in the state of California where the risks are deemed to be so high that the costs on a regulatory side make it virtually prohibited, even though fracking is not prohibited. But aquifer risks are really not great. I'd say the 2 greatest risks are seismic activity risks that are associated with disposing of drilling material beneath the surface of the earth, something you can't do in Pennsylvania. You can no longer do in Ohio after a series of earthquakes underneath the city of Youngstown. You can't do it in Texas, but you can do it in Oklahoma, hence a greater incidence of earthquakes in Oklahoma than in Texas. So there are risks. They are deemed by every study that has been done not to be consequential, but they are risks that people worry about when drilling of this type takes place in their backyard. I'd say the bigger risks are risks associated with waste disposal above the ground and risks associated with the adequacy of a regulatory system. So on waste disposal above the ground, there are a lot of things that happen. You have sands brought in, you have, and here's the most difficult of all to regulate, you have trucks that run on diesel. Diesel leaks are toxic. Diesel leaks toxicity can affect groundwater and groundwater reservoirs. Very difficult to deal with in that this is a very trucking-intensive business. Truckers in the U.S. Tend to not be skilled. In the state of North Dakota, where fracking has revolutionized the economy of a state and where unemployment is now 1.5%, which means there isn't any. Truckers can be 16, they can be 85. Truckers tend to have a higher incidence of alcohol and drug abuse than the normal member of the U.S. population. And getting regulators in place to monitor truckers is a very expensive, difficult thing to do. So adequacy of regulatory controls is a very difficult issue. There are environmental risks. Best practices can work to reduce them significantly, close enough to zero in my judgment and other people's judgments, but not in everybody's judgment, to make the trade-off between those risks and the economic consequences of capitalizing on these resources worth it. The other risk is a price risk. It appears as though some countries in OPEC want to see lower prices, radically lower prices, in order to see whether the shale revolution is going to be impacted. We've analyzed that extensively. We think that those OPEC countries that believe that, or the people in the street who believe that in other countries, or even the geologists elsewhere who believe that, are wrong. We think that this is so robust that it will withstand significantly lower prices. Particularly robust because we have OPEC, which after the MENA Spring, the Arab Spring of 2011, are seeing, and this is true of every oil-producing country, including Russia, every petrostate countries that depend more than 50% on the export of oil and gas for government revenue. They have higher and higher budget break-even numbers. Russia's is about $110 a barrel to break even on their budget, and currently they're getting $78 a barrel for their exports. The countries in the Middle East, even the rich ones, all have budgetary break-even costs that are higher than the current price of oil. In the case of Nigeria or Venezuela or Iraq or Iran, the budgetary break-even is well above the prevailing price when we hit our record prices of this year at $115 a barrel in June. So this is a challenge, and the OPEC countries can't really meet their revenue requirements forever at significantly lower oil prices. Meanwhile, half-cycle costs have come to play in North Dakota and in Texas, where we have our most mature production. And the half-cycle costs of continuing to expand production are $35 to $45 a barrel, not $75 to $85 a barrel. So we believe that under almost any price scenario that we think is realistic for the year, U.S. production will probably grow at the same rate next year as it grew this year, 1 million barrels a day. And it may even be that it grows at a faster rate because of technological and efficiency gains, and because you zone in on the cheapest things you can do when the price you receive in the market is lower. And we fail to see any scenario at oil above $60 a barrel in which U.S. production will not grow positively. It may not grow by 1 million barrels a day per year, but it'll grow significantly enough. So with that, I hope I've whetted your appetite, and I'm happy to respond to questions. I will not be the moderator of my own answers. So.
Well, we certainly do thank you. And having memorized all the data, the floor is open for questions. Yes, sir. If you use propane, should you convert?
Or if you don't use propane, should you convert? I didn't talk about one relatively arcane, I think, subject to an audience of non-specialists. But with our natural gas production, we also produce something called natural gas liquids. And with our oil production, we produce something called condensates, which are ultra-light crude oil, essentially naphtha. So the U.S. has become unwittingly a very large producer of natural gas liquids and of condensates. And we're starting to export condensates through some decisions that were made to the surprise of the White House in June by the Commerce Department to allow condensate that are produced in a field and that are processed in a field by being stabilized and being distilled to be exported as though it was product. We can export product, gasoline, diesel, propane, butane, ethane freely. We can't export crude oil freely. It's highly restricted. The U.S. on the natural gas liquid side, and propane is one of these natural gas liquids, as is ethane and butane and pentane pluses. We started seeing exports of these. The U.S. was a net importer of a product made of and out of natural gas liquids called liquefied petroleum gases. We were a net importer. We now are not just a net exporter, but we are the largest exporter in the world of LPG or NGLs, if you want to think of it unprocessed. And our surplus will grow threefold between now and 2020. We began to see the propane surplus a year ago. We export propane in large quantities to Latin America. The government was worried last winter when propane prices spiked. But the fact is that we have a propane excess, and that will grow. Already, much of the taxi fleet in Boston has converted taxi use from gasoline to propane. The U.S. used to, during World War II, use a significant amount of propane, not just in farm vehicles, but in other vehicles when we were, because of the war effort, gasoline short. But propane is useful as a transportation fuel as well as a heating fuel. When I, after Hurricane Sandy, put in my own little power supply, it actually is a pretty big power supply at my house, I opted to use propane rather than diesel because I saw the trajectory of prices over time reversing, with diesel becoming significantly more expensive and propane being less expensive. Other than last winter, that's generally been the case. The NGL basket has been traditionally trading at 40% of the crude oil level. It's now, even as crude oil prices have gone down, in the U.S., the NGL basket is 30% of the crude oil basket. So we'll be increasingly surplus country. Prices may be going up because there's foreign demand for it. So the domestic consumer will have to compete with the foreign consumer, but there's a transportation differential to ship stuff abroad. So the U.S. should have the cheapest propane prices in the world.
How much contamination is there from the wastewater that's used, and how much regulation or monitoring of aquifers?
Yeah. So it depends on where you are. I really don't want to get into debate on the Susquehanna River. To be sure, there was contamination. I don't want to get into debate on it because I just, from where I stand and from the evidence that I've read, yes, there's been contamination, but it's kind of nothing in comparison to industrial waste in the history of contamination of waterways. And by and large, the amount of sands that are used in fracking are lower in toxicity than people tend to think. I think there are two aspects of the regulation that are critical to note. One is, in some states, and Pennsylvania is one of them, nobody can keep secret what is put into fracking sands. You have to be transparent about it. And the other in the state of Pennsylvania is you must recycle everything so that the water that comes out of the treated water used for hydraulic fracturing has less toxicity than groundwater normally does. So it's expensive, but the industry has been able to bear the expense and to bear the expense of recycling of water. So and that's another issue on the water use. Water is recycled once it is treated. Again, it's a matter of regulation. One of the reasons that we are unlikely to see as extensive a use of hydraulic fracturing in China or Wyoming, Utah versus Pennsylvania has to do with adequacy of water and the ability to recycle it. There are states like Oklahoma that have very weak regulations, and where it's up to the local voting public to try to change government to put in place stiffer regulatory requirements. I think in Oklahoma it's happening because people really don't like earthquakes, and the incidence has been frightening to a lot of people, even though drilling activity has increased. So, I think the biggest problem with regulation is that it is human resource intensive, and the question is whether state governments will be willing to hire the number of people who can effectively monitor the activities of companies that some of which abide by best practices and some of which don't. I think it only takes one or two disasters to end up with significant banning of these activities, and I think it's a greater danger in a country that doesn't have a history of regulatory, acceptable regulatory controls than it is in the U.S., but I worry about it in the U.S. where best practices are not put in place and where the human resource potential is not hired, trained, and used.
The question was how bad or good, I presume, is the Keystone Pipeline going to be?
I clearly am prejudiced in some respect. Here is a new pipeline being built in a country that has thousands of pipelines, some of which were laid down 70 or 80 years ago, and they ought to really be replaced because they are a menace to mankind. So we're having a debate on a pipeline on several dimensions. One, originally the president vetoed it on the grounds that it was penetrating the largest aquifer in the country, an aquifer in the state of Nebraska, where landowners, farmers were upset by what I consider to be propaganda by 2 or 3 environmental groups. There are over 100 pipelines that go through that aquifer. They really should be removed, and a pipeline of seamless steel wrapped in cement is certainly a lot better than what already goes through that aquifer. There are 2 other aspects to the debate, however. One is whether it's wrong to facilitate dirty Canadian crude oil produced in an unsavory manner because there are a lot of emissions associated with that production, whether we should allow that to come through a pipeline. And the other element of it is whether either we should allow refiners to use this dirty bitumen or allow exports through our ports of this dirty bitumen to the outside world. On the merits of the pipeline, as opposed to what else is taking place, there are pipelines from Canada. There's another big system. That system is under permit going to, between now and the month of March, see the amount of this dirty crude from Canada, dirtier if it comes by train in rail, and therefore it really is bitumen, or comes through pipeline with condensate mixed in with it, and it's diluted with diluent, so it's dilbit. There's going to be incrementally between 300,000 and 400,000 barrels a day of this stuff coming through pipelines permitted that are grandfathered. So Keystone XL or not, this is going to happen, and is happening. Other pipelines will allow it to be exported to other parts of the world. So I think the debate, if it's an open and honest one, is whether you think it's wrongful to allow the production of Canadian bitumen rather than whether the pipeline should be laid. Because the pipeline will not deter the production or export of bitumen, and it won't impede a significant growth of that material through the pipeline system and the rail system of the United States, nor will it impede under the law, unless the laws are changed, and I see virtually no likelihood of that happening, to restrict the re-export of Canadian crude once it hits the U.S. So I guess I made it pretty clear that it's an environmental issue, pure and simple, and it doesn't have a lot to do with the technicalities of environmental impact statements related to that pipeline being laid in the U.S. And the one other place that was trying to restrict imports of bitumen, which was the European Union, has now rescinded all of the restrictions they placed on it. So the question is expectations about the OPEC meeting and where oil prices are likely to go, and would I buy shares in an oil producer? I can answer the latter part quickly. So I work in a regulated part of the U.S. economy, and I'm not allowed to opine on that subject. I actually don't have a license to opine on that subject. On the first part of the question, which was oil prices, so I published a report 2 years ago called Zeroing In on Long-Term Oil Prices, and I used geopolitics and weather and economic activity aside, where you can measure where oil prices are going. And I came to the conclusion that the current band of Brent trading, which was $90 to $120 a barrel, was going to move lower, so that the $90 floor of that band was going to become a ceiling, and the floor would likely be in the $65 to $70 range. We upped it. We redid that study last week. Actually, I think it was published yesterday. So we just republished it, reconfirmed the $70 to $90 trading range. And I think that's the world that we have to get used to. It has positive economic consequences for the U.S. Next year versus 2014, the results at the pump will be effectively the same as a $700 tax rebate per household in the United States, or at least every household that has a car and consumes it on average. And there are positive GDP effects as well. The benefits and costs are asymmetrical. So the problem is that the benefits are diffused around the globe. The IMF argues that for every $10 drop in the price of oil, there's a 0.2% increase in global GDP. With the $35 that have so far been dropped out of the price of oil, that gives you a 0.7%, nearly 1% increase in global GDP. That's not a low number, but it is diffused, and some countries get it more than others. So a big oil importing country like China or Japan or Korea would see more results of that than Brazil, which is net self-sufficient. On the other hand, the pain of this is highly concentrated in oil-producing countries that are fragile and which have spurned a lot of terrorism and other bad things that we don't like to see happen. And already, as a result of this wealth transfer that's taken place in a very short period of time, the average OPEC citizen has had revenues from oil of $2,500 per person in 2013, and they're now running at a rate of about $1,800 per person. So, it's highly concentrated pain. You've got to evaluate the pluses and minuses of that process.
Let me ask you to comment just very briefly on why one can't neutralize the Russian control over the economies of Western Europe.
You mentioned when I was in the U.S., you mentioned a period of time when I was in the U.S. government. So when I was in the U.S. government, and I served under two presidents, a Democratic and a Republican president, and at that time, the first major gas pipeline from Russia to Western Europe was being planned. The U.S. and two European countries, France and the United Kingdom, staked out terms for that, which we thought the German government and others, German government, the Italian government, were the principal proponents of that gas imports. We suggested that the way to manage it is to limit the amount of gas imports to 20% of total consumption and to build a significant infrastructure of storage so that they would not be subject to undue political influence by the then Soviet government for using their natural gas. And exactly what the French and the British were arguing more than the U.S. was that if the Soviets invaded Poland, they would not be able to impose sanctions on the Soviet Union if they were overly dependent on those resources. So fast forward to today, and the dependence is over 30%, and the storage facilities have not been built. Europe was relatively complacent. I think it's no longer as complacent as it was. Fortunately for them, the Russians have very little choice because the Russians are really much more dependent on selling natural gas and oil into Western Europe than the Europeans are in buying it. Certainly this is the case for oil more so because it's fungible and it's not pipeline constrained than for natural gas. Fortunately for Europe as well, they're deindustrializing, so their natural gas use is going down. It's significantly lower now by 8% than it was 2 years ago. And they are building storage. So what they're not doing is opening themselves up for exploitation of their own resource base. They are opening themselves up to buy American LNG to substitute for Russian pipeline gas. There is some rationality to that, but it's not as good a trade-off, perhaps, as developing their own indigenous resources.
Well, it's been a spectacular evening, I must say. Thank you very much.